Hey guys, today we're going to learn how to master CSS Grid. Let's get started. Hey guys, today we're going to go ahead and finally finish up with display and position in CSS. The focus for today will be CSS Grid and how it's different from the display option that we learned last week, which was Flexbox, a one-dimensional system for organizing content in web. Today, with CSS Grid, we'll take it a level further and learn how to manipulate elements in space with a two-dimensional system for organizing content on web, and you really, if you wanted to, you could argue that it's three-dimensional as well. But let's go ahead and jump into exactly what CSS Grid is and how it works. So before jumping into the exact rules, the CSS property values and properties that we're going to be changing, I want to discuss what a two-dimensional system really means. And really all we have to understand is that we get to control things going in two different directions. So we're essentially creating the system where we can decide where our content can land wherever on a line based on an X and a Y axis. So with that simple understanding that we're essentially working with a coordinate grid, just like any graph, just like any system where you've used, just like any coordinate system. So if you've ever played Battleship, you'll be able to understand how CSS Grid works. So to get started, let's go ahead and look at our first value, which is obviously the display property of grid. And in order to get to grid to work, just like Flexbox, we actually see what is known as a parent and child relationship between the elements in our system. What that really means is that we have our large block containing the smaller blocks. So the large block is the parent, and we have a certain set of rules in order to control things as the parent element, whereas with the child element, there's CSS properties specifically for how that child should act inside of the parent element. So let's get started with the parent. To begin with CSS Grid, let's go ahead and discuss those CSS properties that we'll be using in order to control how things are displayed inside of our little playing field. So to get started, there's going to be two rules that really dictate exactly how our grid is going to be displayed. And those two rules will be grid template rows and let's get rid of that tab. Grid template columns. With these two commands, we'll be able to go ahead and let me add my semicolons. With these two commands, we'll have control over both the rows, meaning how large and wide each individual row is in our box, as well as the columns and how thick and or thin they are in these columns. So for an example, I can go ahead and start with the rows first. Let's look at our rows as the way they are now and observe the fact that they're all exactly the same size, there's no gaps, and actually if I remove my height, we'll see it stay the same. In order to adjust this, let's go ahead and say each row is equal to, in this case, our first row would be equal to 20 pixels. And like that, you already see that my first block shrunk. And that's because this block is going to go ahead and fit into whatever the row is in CSS Grid. Now, if you already have a preset height on your block, it will actually stay in the exact same place, but just overlap on top of other things. But back to grid template rows, you'll notice that the syntax here will include multiple variables, meaning we'll have to, you can really think of it as just like reading a book. You'll go in order depending on what numbers and or measurements you put in. For example, I can actually mix different types of spaces inside of the CSS grid. So, for example, I went 20 pixels and then a 20%. I'll add another 20 pixel row, and you can see that the block 2 is a lot larger than block 1 and block 3. And we can keep going with this forever for as many rows as we need to make. But usually you'll only use CSS Grid in the instance where you need control over a certain area. And the same applies for columns. So for example, if I wanted my first column with every single block in it to be wider, I would go ahead and use, let's use a virtual width. Now, virtual width and virtual height are kind of exactly like percentages, except for they actually account for the pixel width or pixel density of the device being used. So with a 20 virtual width, we see that we stay about the same. Let's see. It's not activating, so let's go ahead and figure out why. So to actually touch on the issue that I just ran into, it was the exact problem I was talking about, where if a block had a set width, which was set to 100 pixels by 100 pixels, it would overlap over the other items. So I went ahead and set them to percentages, just so we could visualize how these rows and columns actually work. So for an example, we can see that here I've set my first row and my first column to be equal to the size of 100 pixels and then 200 pixels high, meaning that this block 1 is actually taking up its full column of 200 pixels here and taking its space of 100 pixels. If I wanted it to take up more space vertically, all I would do is change the row size, and we'll switch it over to 400, and you'll see that block 1's massive. So really, all we're doing is controlling the size of the boxes based on how wide and how tall we want something to be. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to how we control the children within CSS Grid. So in order to begin with the children element, I actually went ahead and made a bit of changes to my HTML and my CSS. I added an ID for each individual block in order to control each individual block, and gave them their own specific name for each of their block numbers. Now, to get started, we're going to begin with the property value, the CSS property of grid row start and grid row end. These two will actually be reflective of the exact same thing we'll do with columns. So in total, there will be 4 rules. We'll have grid row start, grid row end, grid column start, and grid column end. With these 4 rules, let me go ahead and get them all in here. We can go ahead and control each individual block and decide what area, what coordinate it should be inside of the CSS grid. So let me go ahead and add a start and an end to these. And with this, let's go ahead and decide. I want block 1. Wait, before I decide to coordinate grid, I gotta realize that we have a 3x3 grid going on. So at most, I can have my grid end at line 4, not 3. Just because we will take the starting line of our box as row 1 or box 1, and essentially the way CSS Grid works is our starting line is 1, then we have 2, because it is the beginning of row or column 2, and then finally the line between this right here would be the beginning of 3, so we would consider this line number 3. So if we wanted to start a block inside of and have it be inside of the 3rd column, we would tell our system to start at line number 3. So, and to do so, let's go ahead and flip things around by doing exactly what I just described. So we'll go ahead and start our grid row at 3. Oh, well, we don't want our row, we want our column. So I'll start at 3 and end it at line 4. And you'll see that block 1 got pushed over into the third row, as illustrated here by block 1 being in 1, block 3 being in row 2, and block 4 being in row 3, right below block 1. So if we wanted to go even further, let's go ahead and make sure that the other blocks can move up to the top without being disturbed by block 1 and pushing it out of the way. So to do that, I'll go ahead and move this to grid row 2 and end it at line 3, which is the line that would start the following row. So just like this, with these 4 rules, we have a coordinate system to decide exactly where we want our blocks inside of a CSS grid to be. And with this, there is literally endless possibilities for how you could format something on the web. Whether it's circles, triangles, squares, any odd shapes or blobs you can think of, you can finally have a system to contain them all that isn't reliant on a relative system based on the top, bottom, left, and right of your screen. So to move on, we'll go ahead and explore what we can really do with this sort of a system and a couple of extra rules that CSS Grid has added in order to make use a lot easier. So to begin with those luxury properties that we've been granted through CSS, we'll go ahead and start with the parent element again. And this, I'm calling it a luxury because it really feels like magic when you're developing with these sorts of tools. And I'll go ahead and start with row gap. With this new CSS property, we can go ahead and actually define how wide we want the gaps between our rows or our columns to be inside of our CSS grid. So I'll go ahead and create a column gap property as well, and I'll set this to 15 pixels. And suddenly, like magic, you'll see where the lines are in our CSS grid. And if you really have trouble with CSS Grid, you can use this as a visual guide when you're working with systems like this. Moving forward, I feel a really important thing to touch on with the child element would be the fact that we don't have to use 4 rules, but rather we could use 2 rules for the grid row and the grid columns. And really, all we would do is change grid row start and grid row end and condense it down to grid row. And here, what I can do is go ahead and tell the system with a starting place. And like we stated earlier, our row was on, the row for block 1 was on number 3, on number 2, and it would end at 3. So with this syntax, I simply put the starting row followed by a /, and then ending with the row or the line that we want our row to end at. And we can do the same for column. So, like so, we'll start the element at 3 and end it at 4. And just like that, we're back to the organization that we had previously. And finally, when it comes to CSS Grid, it's really important to be able to keep track of where everything is within your system. Now, when it comes to this, there is a certain property called Css Grid Area. Well, not Css Grid Area, but simply Grid Area. I won't be touching on Grid Area today because I believe it's best learned through practice yourself, simply because it becomes a tangled web really quickly. It's really important to research the study of naming and how to document your items and elements within HTML before you really start giving everything in your system arbitrary names, things that could potentially end up confusing another developer that could come onto your team. So with this, we've given a brief but somewhat deep understanding of what CSS Grid is. We have our two-dimensional system where we can, again, just control the blocks, their positions, how wide, how tall they are, how small and short. Whether it needs to, it really doesn't care for shape. All it cares about is keeping this nice, clean, simple to use coordinate grid for organizing elements within HTML. Hopefully you'll join us next week when we touch on CSS events, which are commonly interpreted as hover effects on buttons and other things like that. So until then, have a nice day.